Monica Carter had just finished a long day at work. As a businesswoman, her schedule was always packed, and today was no different. She had spent hours in meetings, answering emails, and making important decisions. Now, all she wanted was to grab a bottle of water before heading home. She pulled into a small convenience store on the corner of a quiet street. The parking lot was mostly empty, except for a few cars. The bright store lights flickered against the dark sky, and the cool evening air brushed against her skin as she stepped out of her car. Monica was used to handling herself with confidence. She wasn't afraid to walk alone at night, but she always stayed aware of her surroundings. Inside, she picked up a bottle of water, paid quickly, and stepped back outside. As she walked toward her car, she noticed a police officer standing near the entrance. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a dark uniform. His badge gleamed under the store's bright lights. Monica didn't think much of it. Officers often patrolled around stores at night. Just as she reached her car, she heard a deep voice behind her. "Excuse me, ma'am." Monica turned around to see the officer stepping closer. He had a friendly smile, but something about the way he looked at her made her uneasy. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, keeping her tone calm. He glanced at her car and then back at her. "Just a routine check. Mind showing me some ID?" Monica frowned. A routine check. She had lived in this city for years. She had never been stopped like this before, especially not for simply walking out of a store. But she wasn't the type to cause a scene. Instead of arguing, she reached into her purse and pulled out her driver's license. The officer took his time looking at it. Too much time. His eyes didn't seem focused on the card at all. He gave her a strange smile, one that didn't feel right. "You live around here?" he asked, his tone too casual. "Yes," Monica answered shortly. "I'm just heading home." She reached for her license, but he didn't hand it back right away. Instead, he took a small step closer. The distance between them shrank, and Monica's discomfort grew. She had dealt with difficult people before in business meetings, but this was different. This wasn't a negotiation. She forced herself to stay calm. "Officer, if there's nothing wrong, I'd like to be on my way." He finally handed back her license but didn't move away. His presence felt heavy, pressing into her space. Monica's fingers tightened around the bottle of water in her hand. Her instincts told her to leave quickly, but she also knew she had to handle this carefully. "I was just making sure everything's okay," he said smoothly. "You never know who you might run into late at night." Monica gave a polite nod, not showing the frustration rising inside her. She had seen situations like this before, where someone in authority thought they could get away with too much. But she wasn't going to make a scene, not yet. Instead, she memorized everything. The officer's face, his name tag, the way he spoke. She took a slow breath and stepped back toward her car. "Have a good night, officer," she said, her voice steady. Then, without waiting for a response, she got into her car, locked the doors, and drove off. Her hands gripped the wheel tightly, her mind racing. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. What the officer didn't know was that Monica wasn't just any woman. Her husband was Captain James Carter, one of the most respected leaders in the police force, and he was about to find out everything. Monica drove home in silence, her hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. The city lights blurred past her, but she barely noticed them. Her mind was too busy replaying what had just happened. Every word, every look, every uneasy feeling, it all stayed fresh in her memory. She had always been strong, always handled herself well in difficult situations, but tonight had been different. Tonight, she had felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. A deep sense of discomfort, the kind that stayed with you long after the moment was over. As she pulled into her driveway, she took a deep breath and tried to shake it off. The house was quiet and warm, a place that always made her feel safe. But even as she stepped inside, the uneasy feeling followed her. She found her husband, Captain James Carter, sitting in the living room, going over some paperwork. He had spent years in the police force, working his way up with honesty and hard work. He had always believed in justice, in doing the right thing. James looked up as she walked in. He could tell something was wrong the moment he saw her face. "What's wrong?" he asked, putting his papers aside. Monica hesitated for a moment, then sat down across from him. She wasn't the type to complain. She didn't like causing unnecessary trouble, but this wasn't something she could ignore. "There was an officer at the store," she said slowly. "He stopped me for no reason. Asked for my ID." James frowned. "Did he say why?" "No," she said. "He called it a routine check, but it didn't feel like one." James leaned forward, his sharp eyes watching her closely. "What else happened?" Monica took another deep breath. "He made me uncomfortable, James. The way he looked at me, the way he stood too close, it wasn't right." Silence filled the room for a moment. James's jaw tightened. He had spent years dealing with officers like that, ones who thought their badge gave them power over people in the wrong way. He had worked hard to clean up his department, to make sure the right kind of officers were put in charge. But there were always a few who slipped through, a few who thought they could get away with anything. "Did you get his name?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Monica nodded. "Dalton. Officer Rick Dalton." James closed his eyes for a second, as if trying to control the anger building inside him. Then he stood up and walked to his desk. Monica watched as he opened a drawer and pulled out his laptop. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I need to check his record," James said, typing quickly. "I want to see if there have been other complaints against him." Monica stayed silent as James worked. She had seen this side of him before, the focused, determined side. He wasn't just reacting as her husband. He was reacting as a man who believed in justice. A few minutes later, James's expression darkened. He turned the laptop toward her. "There are no official complaints against him," he said, "but I've heard his name before. A few quiet reports, rumors, nothing ever written down." Monica wasn't surprised. She knew how things worked sometimes. People like Dalton didn't always leave a paper trail, but that didn't mean they were innocent. James closed the laptop and looked at her. "I need you to file a report," he said. Monica hesitated. She had already been through enough tonight. Did she really want to go through the process of filing a complaint? But then she thought about it. If she stayed silent, what if Dalton did this to someone else? She nodded. "I'll do it." James reached for his phone. "I'll handle the rest." Monica knew one thing for sure. Officer Dalton had messed with the wrong person. And now he was about to find out exactly who he had crossed. James Carter was not a man who acted on impulse. Throughout his career, he had learned that patience and strategy always led to better results than anger. But tonight, as he sat in his home office, his hands resting on his phone, he felt a fire burning inside him. His wife had just come home, shaken after being treated unfairly by one of his own officers. That thought alone was enough to make his jaw tighten. But what made it worse was the fact that Officer Rick Dalton had done this before, more than once. James had spent years cleaning up the force, making sure good officers stayed and bad ones were removed. Yet somehow, Dalton had slipped through the cracks. There had never been an official complaint against him, but James had heard the whispers. He had heard from other officers about how Dalton acted when no one was watching. Well, this time, someone was watching. James stood up, took a deep breath, and dialed a number. "Captain Carter," a voice answered. It was Sergeant Daniels, one of James's most trusted men. "Daniels, I need you to pull all unofficial reports on Officer Dalton. Anything that's been mentioned, even if it wasn't written down," James said, his voice calm but firm. There was a short pause. "Is this about what happened tonight?" Daniels asked. James wasn't surprised. News traveled fast in the police world. "Yes," James replied. "But I have a feeling tonight wasn't the first time." Daniels sighed. "I'll see what I can find." After hanging up, James leaned back in his chair. He knew Monica was strong. She had handled the situation well, but that didn't mean she should have had to deal with it at all. He couldn't let this go. He wouldn't. A few minutes later, Monica walked into the office. She had changed into comfortable clothes, but he could see that she was still thinking about what happened. "What's going to happen now?" she asked. James sighed. "First, we need to make sure this gets documented. That means you filing a complaint." Monica nodded. "I already said I would." James studied her face. She wasn't afraid, but he could tell she was tired of these kinds of situations. She had spent years proving herself in the business world, dealing with people who underestimated her. She shouldn't have to fight for respect in a simple trip to the store. "I don't want you to worry," James said. "Dalton isn't going to get away with this." Monica gave him a small smile. "I know." Just then, James's phone buzzed. He picked it up and saw a text from Daniels. "Found something. You were right. Dalton has a pattern." James's jaw clenched as he opened the message. Daniels had sent over a list of quiet reports. Things officers had mentioned, but never officially filed. Dalton had been stopped before, questioned about his behavior, but nothing had ever stuck. Either the reports were dismissed, or the people involved were too afraid to take it further. Not this time. James looked at Monica. "It's worse than we thought." She raised an eyebrow. "How bad?" James handed her the phone. "Bad enough that I'm going to make sure this ends now." Monica read the messages and nodded. "Then let's do it." James felt a sense of pride as he looked at her. She wasn't just strong, she was fearless. Officer Dalton had made a mistake that would cost him. Because now, he wasn't just facing a complaint. He was facing Captain James Carter. James Carter knew that taking action against Officer Dalton required a smart approach. He couldn't just walk into the station and demand his badge. That wasn't how things worked. If he wanted real justice, he had to be careful. Early the next morning, James arrived at the police station. The sun was just rising, casting a golden glow over the city. Inside, the station was already buzzing with activity. Officers checking reports, phones ringing, and detectives discussing cases over coffee. James walked straight to his office, his mind focused. He wasn't just dealing with a bad officer. He was dealing with someone who had managed to avoid consequences for too long. That meant Dalton had friends in the system, people who had covered for him. James needed to find out who they were. Just as he sat down at his desk, Sergeant Daniels walked in, holding a folder. He closed the door behind him before speaking. "I pulled more reports," Daniels said, placing the folder on the desk. "You were right. Dalton's been mentioned in multiple complaints, but none of them went anywhere." James opened the folder. Inside were notes from different officers, quiet concerns that had never turned into official cases. Officer Dalton tends to push boundaries. Citizens seem uncomfortable around him. Multiple verbal warnings, but no formal action taken. James shook his head, and no one did anything. Daniel sighed. A few tried, but their reports got buried. Someone's protecting him. James clenched his jaw. He had suspected it, but seeing the proof in front of him made his anger grow. He flipped through the papers, noting the patterns. Dalton had been careful, never crossing the line enough to get caught on record. But this time was different. This time, he had targeted the wife of the police captain. James looked up at Daniels. "We're doing this the right way. No shortcuts. I want an official investigation started today." Daniels nodded. "I'll talk to Internal Affairs." James knew that wouldn't be enough. Internal Affairs could take weeks, even months, to take real action. And in that time, Dalton could continue working as if nothing had happened. James needed more than just paperwork. He needed proof. "Daniels," he said, closing the folder. "We're going to set a trap." Daniels raised an eyebrow. "A sting operation?" James nodded. "I want to catch Dalton in the act. I want evidence that no one can ignore." Daniels thought for a moment, then said, "I know just the person for the job." An hour later, James sat in a small meeting room with Officer Lisa Grant, an undercover specialist. She was sharp, quick-thinking, and had experience dealing with officers like Dalton. "You think he'll take the bait?" Lisa asked, leaning back in her chair. James nodded. "If he thinks no one is watching, yes." Lisa smiled. "Then let's make sure someone is watching." Over the next few hours, the team put together a plan. Lisa would pose as a civilian in a routine patrol area where Dalton often worked. A hidden camera would capture everything. If Dalton acted inappropriately, they would have solid evidence. By the time the plan was ready, James felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of certainty. Dalton had avoided consequences for too long, but now his time was running out. James wasn't just going to stop him. He was going to expose him. The plan was set. James Carter's team worked quickly, putting every detail in place. Officer Lisa Grant, who had volunteered for the undercover operation, was briefed thoroughly. She was no stranger to undercover work, but this felt different. The stakes were higher. Dalton wasn't just another officer on the beat. He was someone who had gotten away with too much for too long. The operation needed to be perfect. It wasn't just about getting evidence. It was about making sure there was no way anyone could deny what Dalton had done. The location was carefully chosen. It was a quiet street that Officer Dalton often patrolled, and Lisa knew the area well. She would walk down the street at the same time each day, acting like a regular citizen. The hope was that Dalton would act the same way he always did, arrogant, thinking no one was watching. James watched from the control room. Hidden cameras were set up along the street, well concealed so that they wouldn't be detected. The entire operation was designed to be smooth, without any room for error. Lisa was in position, walking casually down the sidewalk as planned. She wore simple clothing, nothing too flashy. She had to look just like anyone else who might be out for a walk in the neighborhood. James kept a close eye on the monitors, his mind racing as he waited. Everything had to go according to plan. One mistake, and Dalton could slip away again, untouched. Then it happened. Around the same time as the previous days, Officer Dalton's patrol car turned onto the street. He slowed as he saw Lisa walking, a slight smile on his face as he approached her. James's heart rate quickened. This was the moment. Dalton stopped the car a few feet away from Lisa. From the camera angles, James could clearly see the officer's movements. Dalton stepped out of the car and made his way toward Lisa. She continued walking, pretending not to notice him. But James knew she was ready. The conversation started like any other routine check, with Dalton asking if everything was okay. But it didn't take long before his tone changed. He was becoming more casual, more comfortable, as if he felt he could act however he wanted. The smile on his face widened, and it was clear to everyone watching that his behavior was beginning to cross a line. Lisa kept her cool, responding politely, just like a regular citizen would. But the camera showed everything, every little detail. Dalton's actions, his words, the way he positioned himself as if to make her feel uncomfortable, were all there for the world to see. He had no idea that his every move was being recorded. James felt a mix of frustration and satisfaction. He had known this was what would happen. Dalton's arrogance would be his downfall. But even so, it wasn't enough yet. James needed to see more, to make sure there was no room for Dalton to deny his actions. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dalton made his move. He took another step closer to Lisa, leaning in slightly as he asked more personal questions. Lisa, ever the professional, didn't flinch. She kept her responses short, never letting Dalton think he was in control. That was when the moment they had been waiting for arrived. Dalton's behavior escalated. His words became more inappropriate, crossing a line that no officer should ever cross, let alone think was acceptable. He stepped closer than before, making Lisa visibly uncomfortable. But by that point, the hidden cameras had caught everything. There was no denying what had just happened. Every action, every word, Every inappropriate step Dalton had taken was now on tape. James exhaled slowly, his heart pounding. The evidence was undeniable. There was no way Dalton could talk his way out of this now. As soon as Lisa finished the interaction and walked away, James gave the signal. The operation was over. Dalton had been caught. He had thought no one would ever challenge him, but now his career was in jeopardy. James knew the fight wasn't over yet. There was still paperwork to file, meetings to attend, and conversations to be had. But for the first time in a long time, he felt certain. Officer Dalton's days of misconduct were coming to an end. He had the evidence, and now it was time to make sure the truth came. The following morning, James Carter sat at his desk, the weight of the previous day's events still fresh on his mind. The footage from the operation had been gathered, reviewed, and confirmed. There was no doubt that Officer Dalton had crossed a line, one that could no longer be ignored. James's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Sergeant Daniels. "The footage is in. It's all there." James let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. This was it, the moment he had been working toward. He stood up, straightened his tie, and walked to the conference room where Daniels and Officer Grant were already waiting. The room felt quiet, tense, as if everyone in it could sense the gravity of the situation. The video footage was displayed on the screen in front of them. It was clear, undeniable. The actions of Officer Dalton were now documented for the world to see. Lisa Grant spoke first. "We have what we need. It's all on tape. No way he gets away with this." James nodded, but the situation wasn't as simple as just showing the footage. This was an internal matter, one that would go all the way up the chain of command. Dalton had allies, people who would defend him no matter what. It wasn't just about the video. It was about making sure the right people saw it and understood the full picture. "I'll talk to Internal Affairs first thing," James said, his voice steady. "They need to be the ones to investigate formally." "But what if they try to cover it up?" Daniels asked, his tone concerned. "What if they sweep it under the rug again?" James paused. He had seen how things worked behind the scenes. Sometimes people in power tried to protect their own, especially if they believed it was in the department's best interest. But James wasn't about to let that happen this time. "Then we make sure everyone knows," James said, his voice firm. "This goes public if it has to. We do this by the book, but we're not letting Dalton get away with it." Lisa gave a sharp nod. Agreed. With the plan in motion, James made the call to Internal Affairs. The conversation was quick and to the point. He knew the person on the other end well, and that made it easier to cut through the usual red tape. "Get the investigation started immediately," James instructed. "No delays, no excuses." He could hear the hesitation in the voice on the other end, but James didn't back down. "I'm putting this on the record. This is bigger than just one officer. It's about protecting the integrity of the force." For the rest of the day, James kept a careful eye on the situation. He knew there would be people who tried to downplay Dalton's actions, even with the evidence in front of them. But James had already made his decision. He wasn't going to let this go. Hours later, he received a call from Internal Affairs. The investigation was officially underway, but that was only the beginning. James knew that even though Dalton had been caught, the real battle was just starting. The department would need to make a statement, and there would be people trying to defend Dalton or minimize what he had done. James would have to push harder, ensuring that every officer and every citizen understood that this behavior was unacceptable, no matter who the person was or what their rank was. The pressure was mounting, but James was used to it. He had spent his whole career dealing with tough situations, and this was just another one. But this time, it was personal. It wasn't just about upholding the law. It was about doing right by his wife, his family, and the community that trusted the force. As the day ended, James sat in his office, reflecting on how much had changed. He had always prided himself on his integrity and his ability to keep the department running smoothly. But now he was faced with something that would test every ounce of his leadership. Dalton had made his move. Now James was going to make sure he was held accountable. The following days were a blur for James Carter. After submitting the footage to Internal Affairs, he knew the investigation was officially in motion, but that didn't mean everything would be smooth sailing. The department was under pressure to handle this quietly, to avoid drawing too much attention. But James had made it clear he wasn't going to let this slide. His phone rang constantly, with reporters asking for comments, officers seeking reassurance, and even members of his own department subtly questioning his actions. Some believed Dalton's misconduct was something better dealt with in-house, without the public ever knowing. Others didn't see the severity of the situation at all. But James knew this wasn't just about one officer. It was about maintaining the trust of the community. He spent hours in meetings, speaking with Internal Affairs, reviewing the footage, and discussing the next steps. The footage was irrefutable, but even with that, James had to navigate the political side of the issue. He knew some would try to downplay Dalton's behavior, hoping it would all blow over, but he couldn't let that happen. As the investigation continued, Dalton remained unaware of how deeply his actions were being scrutinized. He went about his patrols, just as he always had, with the same arrogant attitude. James couldn't understand how someone like him had been able to slip through the cracks for so long, but he was determined to fix that now. Meanwhile, Monica had been a rock throughout the entire process. She never wavered in her support of James, even when it was clear this would be a long, complicated road. She understood how hard this would be for him and for their family. Yet every time they spoke, she reminded him why they were doing this, not just for themselves, but for the community that trusted the police to protect them. James knew he was doing the right thing, but that didn't mean it was easy. Every time he walked into the department, he could feel the tension in the air. He had become a target of whispers and side glances, but he couldn't focus on that now. The investigation had to proceed without distractions. One afternoon, James received an unexpected call. It was from one of the higher-ups in the department. "Captain Carter, we need to talk." The voice on the other end said, the tone a little too calm. James didn't like the sound of it. He had a sinking feeling he knew what was coming. He had heard rumors that some were trying to bury the case, make it go away quietly. He wasn't about to let that happen. He met with the officer in a small private meeting room. The conversation was tense, with a lot of subtle hints about how damaging this situation could be for the department. James kept his face neutral, listening carefully to every word. "We both know how things like this can blow over if handled right," the officer said, his tone firm but not threatening. "You don't need to take this any further. We can deal with this internally. No need to involve the media." James fought the urge to roll his eyes. He had heard this before, the familiar plea to sweep things under the rug. It was the same old story, the same plea for silence. "I can't do that," James replied calmly. "This is bigger than Dalton. This is about maintaining the integrity of the entire force. I won't cover this up. It goes public, and everyone needs to know why." The officer frowned but didn't push further. James could tell that the higher-ups were nervous, but they knew he wasn't someone they could intimidate or sway. He wasn't going to let this be another case that was buried. Not this time. As the days went on, the pressure increased. James was getting more calls from the media, reporters demanding answers. The department tried to hold its ground, issuing vague statements, but everyone knew what was happening. The truth was out, and it was only a matter of time before Dalton would face the consequences. But even with the mounting pressure, James felt a sense of pride. His resolve was stronger than ever. He had started something that would not only change Dalton's life, but also send a message to every officer in the department. No one was above the law, not even someone with years of service. The investigation continued, but James knew that the public was already watching. The clock was ticking, and the moment Dalton would have to answer for his actions was drawing closer. The day had finally arrived, the moment when Officer Dalton would be held accountable for his actions. The investigation had moved quickly, and Internal Affairs had completed their review of the footage. There was no longer any doubt. Dalton's behavior was unacceptable, and now it was time for the consequences to unfold. James sat in his office, feeling a strange mix of nerves and relief. This had been a long and difficult journey, but he had seen it through. The truth would come to light, no matter what it cost him or the department. His phone buzzed again, and he answered it without hesitation. "It's done," said Sergeant Daniels, his voice filled with both exhaustion and pride. "Internal Affairs is making their official recommendation. Dalton's being suspended while the department decides what comes next." James nodded, but he knew this wasn't the end. Suspension wasn't enough. Dalton needed to be held accountable in a more meaningful way. This was a chance to show the public that the department wasn't just full of empty promises. They had to prove that they would stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult. Later that afternoon, James was called into a meeting with the chief of police. As he walked into the room, he could feel the tension. The chief's expression was serious, but there was a hint of frustration behind his eyes. "Captain Carter," the chief began, "I understand your position on this matter, but we need to consider the wider implications. The media is all over this, and the department is under a microscope. We need to make sure we handle this carefully." James felt his pulse quicken. He had heard this kind of talk before, a subtle pressure to tone things down, to keep things quiet. But this time, he wasn't backing down. "Chief," James said firmly, "what Dalton did is not something we can just sweep under the rug. If we do that, we send the message that this kind of behavior is acceptable. It's not. And if we don't act now, we'll lose the trust of the community forever." The chief paused, considering his words carefully. James could see the weight of the decision on his face. "You're right," the chief finally said, his tone softer. "But we have to be cautious. We can't let this spiral out of control." James took a deep breath. He knew that this wasn't going to be easy, but he also knew that the right thing wasn't always the popular thing. "It won't spiral out of control if we do the right thing," James said. "The longer we wait, the more it looks like we're covering for him. The department needs to show we're on the side of justice." After a long pause, the chief finally nodded. "All right, Carter. You're right. We'll move forward with disciplinary action. But I want it to be clear to everyone that this is not how we handle these matters. We do this carefully, and we don't let it overshadow the good work our officers do every day." James understood. This wasn't just about Dalton. It was about maintaining the integrity of the entire department. But James was willing to take that challenge head on. In the days that followed, the media coverage only grew. Reporters gathered outside the station, eager for updates. They had heard about the investigation, and now they wanted to know what would happen to Dalton. The pressure on the department mounted, but James didn't waver. Internal Affairs announced their findings. Dalton's suspension would remain in place, while an official review of his actions was conducted. But the public wasn't satisfied with just a suspension. They wanted justice. Finally, the department released a statement that made it clear Dalton's actions were unacceptable, and he would be facing formal charges. It was the right decision, but it came with a heavy price. The media attention was relentless, and there were many within the department who had wished it had never gotten this far. But James knew it had to be done. It wasn't just about Dalton. It was about the message they sent to the people they swore to protect. As the investigation moved forward, James received a call from Monica. "How are you holding up?" she asked, her voice steady but warm. "I'm fine," James said, his voice tired but determined. "This is hard, but it's the right thing." "I'm proud of you," she said, her words comforting. "I know it hasn't been easy, but you're doing what's right. That's what matters." James smiled to himself. He didn't need anyone to tell him that what he had done was the right thing. But hearing Monica's words made it all feel worthwhile. Dalton's days of misconduct were finally over. James had done what needed to be done. And while the road ahead wasn't without its challenges, he had no regrets. In the end, the truth had won. And for James Carter, that was all that mattered.